So you want to incorporate more runs in your orchestral music, but you're struggling. Music with lots of flourishes can be really dense and complex, which makes it difficult to study by ear. Well, believe me, I have been there, and I want to share some of the strategies I've been learning over the last few years to help me write more rich, exciting orchestral passages. In this video, we're going to break down several runs and flourishes that I've written, ranging from simple to more complex, and uncover some tips and tricks you can use in your next composition. And I've also included an uncut version of me composing these passages available to my patrons, link in the description. So here is our first and most basic example for a run. I'm going to play this and then analyze it. Now, if you make an observation, you'll notice that the whole thing is moving upwards. It doesn't mean that they're all doing exactly the same notes, but it does mean that the gesture is moving upwards. Runs and flourishes tend to be very gestural in that way. And the first principle I'd suggest is determine what your actual gesture is and shape the run or flourish based off of that. Another thing to note that's relatively important is this run is happening in the high register. The reason for that is, number one, higher instruments tend to have more versatility than lower instruments. In other words, higher instruments like flutes and violins can move a little faster than basses and bassoons. Now let's break this down by section. First we have the strings, which I composed first, and the strings are just doing this octatonic run. Now, an octatonic run, just to be clear, is an 8-note scale, typically alternating half, whole, or whole, half. The benefit of it, I personally really like it for action music, is that it's very symmetrical. So if I play it on the piano, right, we can divide that by minor thirds. And so it always has the ability to modulate very easily. It also just sounds really cool, and as a scale, it works well because we have 8 notes. So we can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So most of these examples are actually going to use octatonic, but beyond that, it's relatively simple. It's just having us move upwards in the scale. Now, I programmed this, just to be clear, using step input. I did not play this in because it's just too fast for me to play. Now let's check out the woodwinds. Woodwinds are pretty much doing the same thing as the strings, but are divided a little bit differently. Woodwinds need to breathe, of course, so as you have a run that moves up the register, it can be useful to trade off the ideas. So here's the clarinet on its own. Simply just taking the beginning of that passage. Then we have the oboes, flutes, and piccolo pick up the second half. We also have the piccolo carrying it up an octave higher than the strings were, which helps the winds punctuate against the strings. Lastly, we have a little bit of support going on from the harp and the suspended cymbal. So the suspended cymbal just adds a little bit of shimmer. Without it, it would sound like this. And with. And the harp is not doing the exact notes as the strings and winds because it has more versatility to be able to do some flourishy runs. So I'm having it move a little bit quicker, but it's still moving through the same scale. So once more all together, and then we'll move on. Now here's the second example. You can see it's getting a bit more complex. Relatively similar, but one thing we should note is this idea of the exchanging patterns. So we have here in the violins, instead of them playing in unison, they're staggered in their entrances. So check this out. That's literally our violin 1 line being copy-pasted over to violin 2, but delayed. So here's violin 1. And violin 2 displaced. That kind of adds a little bit more interest in there, especially if they're panned left and right. See, if I exaggerated this pan left and right, and you have headphones on, you'll really hear that. Now for the winds, I wanted to have more interest as well. The winds are playing that in slightly different ways. Here's the winds on their own. So we've saved the high register of the winds for the end because I want to have this thing kind of crescendo. And a crescendo doesn't just have to be dynamics. This is an important point to make. Crescendos in orchestral music aren't just about the dynamics, they're about the density and about the registers. So if you want it to feel like it's getting louder, you don't just have to make it get louder, you can add more instruments to it or add more octaves to it. Piccolo is really good for that. So piccolo comes in right at the end here. Now, the dovetailing or the passage of the line is happening here in the clarinets, clarinet 1 and 2. Then we have basically flute and oboe taking the second half, just like it did in the first example, but this time they're an octave apart, and we have the piccolo to give it that extra octave as well. So it's slightly different than what's happening in the strings, but that's what gives it a little bit more interest. Winds and strings together. And we have the harp and the suspended cymbal doing pretty much the same thing as before, except for we have a second harp that's also staggering its entrance, giving us kind of a left-right stereo pan effect. Moving on to our third example, getting more complex now. Okay, lots to dissect here. First of all, the line is moving downwards, but you'll notice that all of the instruments, like I said before, are moving down with it gesturally. So everything is supporting each other in terms of the gesture, even if it's not the same notes. First, let's analyze our strings here. Now, the strings are doing what's called dovetailing, which means that as the line moves down, outside of the register of one instrument, it's being picked up inside the register of another instrument. So the violins and the violas are carrying the first part, and as they move down, the violas and the celli are carrying the second part. So here are the strings on their own. Little punctuation with the basses there. Now, as the starting notes, we're working right down that octatonic scale like I talked about before, moving down diminished. So. Right? Now, I wanted to punctuate those entrances. So that's where I use the brass for the first time. I wanted the brass to be muted because for me, muted brass has a nice kind of snappy sound to it. So all the brass is doing is moving right down that register playing the diminished scale. Right? Now that's muted horns in the beginning with muted trumpet, and then trombone at the end on its own. Together with the winds and strings, actually I'll play the winds first. Winds are doing the same as before in terms of dovetailing, just like the strings were. Now we've also introduced bassoon because the register was getting too low for the other instruments. That's pretty fast for a bassoon. If we wanted to play it safe, we could have them just doing the first notes like we did with the brass, but for now we're just gonna keep it as is. So here are all of the non-percussion instruments playing together so you can see how that works. Notice the punctuation of the brass. Now for the percussion, to add a little bit more excitement and change things up a bit, we do have the harp just on the first half. On the second half, we're introducing chimes, which are helping punctuate with the brass. And to close it out with the button, we have a timpani coming in at the very end. Beyond that, we have glockenspiel that's carrying the first half. So glockenspiel is working with the chimes. So here's all the pitch percussion together. And one last time, all as a unit. Now, in this example, I wanted something with a little bit more chromatic energy and a little bit more separation between the instruments. So we're getting a bit more complex now. I'm going to play it one more time, see if you can identify the roles of the instruments. So the strings are doing a chromatic run. Here it is super slow. It's really just a gestural thing moving chromatically. If you want to figure out how to really get those runs, you can experiment with it performance-wise, play it slowly in your head, or just determine the start and the end notes and work your way slowly towards that. So the strings are the only one that's doing that. The winds are actually doing trills. So the trills are kind of helping us get a little bit of shimmer as opposed to maybe like tremolo. I wanted a bit of support in that diminished chord from the brass, but just to add some interest, I have them actually stagger their entrances. So we start with trumpets, then horns, then trombone. So again, talking about musical orchestral crescendos, staggering entrances, another great way to have it feel like it's building. Here's the winds and the brass together. Now, in terms of our percussion, I wanted to switch it up a little bit. So we actually have a mark tree, a suspended cymbal kind of swipe, and then we have a stick roll in here, which is basically just gives a little shimmer. We also are going to have a couple more instruments. We have a bass drum swell, we have a timpani swell near the end, we have a harp kind of running up and down the diminished scale. We have a celeste that's doing really its own thing, kind of unique to itself. Didn't even bother to quantize because I wanted that muddiness. And lastly, we have xylophone that just punctuates the very ending of the violins. And now I'm gonna play the pitch percussion all on its own with the non-pitch percussion so you can hear how they interact. Now, one thing to note is to keep some interest, I'm being mindful of the repetitions on how often things repeat. So the harp, for example, is repeating its kind of gesture every 2 measures. So it's good. The celeste is repeating every 4 measures and it's moving up an octave. The other textures come in later, like the timpani and the xylophone. By doing that, you're avoiding anything sounding too modular, and it's always feeling like it's evolving in some way. I'll play it one more time. And for our last and probably most complex example here, we have something that's not even really a run so much as it is a flourish, but there are runs in it, so I thought it'd be useful to talk about. When you have lots of passages, whether it's tonal or dissonant, make sure that you have lots of variety in your texture. So you want to have things that are rhythmic, you want to have things that are kind of sustained or shimmery, you want to have a variety of the high and low register. It's all important to making the thing sound full. The thing you'll probably be noticing the most, which was intentional, is this flute line. It's basically just playing sporadic music, and I improvised this in. Now, to support that and punctuate it, because it's really a rhythmic element, I have some xylophone coming in to punctuate various spots. Now, the rest of the textures are mostly just to support this in different ways. The most moving passage we have is going on in the violins. Again, moving right up and down that diminished scale in thirds. Now, just on a programming level, what I typically like to do is add a little bit of accent on some of those downbeats. And when I did that, it gave me the idea to have more of a rocking pattern supported in the clarinets, which were doing exactly that. So here are the clarinets along with the violins. For even more interest, I thought it'd be fun to have the trumpets come in on some of the ands of that. So the trumpets are going to be supporting that texture as well. However, unlike the clarinets, they're going to come every 2 beats. So I'm using orchestration to create more variety, extend the rhythmic length of these ideas. Really, the final texture that we have going on is mostly shimmers. We have basically a snare drum that's replaced our suspended cymbal rolls. And then in our pitched instruments, we don't have harp anymore, except for the very end. We have a little flourish just at the very end. But we do have a little bit more rhythmic support, which is going on in the timpani. And to support that texture, I have a bass drum, like a kick, basically, and then a cymbal crash. Very, very, very typical John Williams thing going on here. So it's da-da-da-dum, boom-ksh, da-da-da-dum, boom-ksh, but on a very odd part of the beat. So that's interacting basically with the xylophone and the flute. And the very last texture we have, just for fun, I have some choir doing this vibrato that's getting wider and wider as it goes. So that's our sustained element. So you see we have the rhythm, we have the sustains, we have the flourishes, and we have a little bit of counterpoint in the timpani. So one more time with this final example, and all of the MIDI for this and the uncut footage of me composing it is available on my Patreon, which I've linked in the description. So there you have it, major takeaways. Make sure that your runs are gestural and that all the instruments are supporting those gestures. Think about the gesture first and construct the run based on that gesture. When you want a crescendo or decrescendo, use orchestration, not just dynamics, to support that movement. So have instruments stack in. And also use orchestration to vary up the rhythmic lengths of your ideas. Don't have everybody moving modularly at the same time. Stagger your entrances, stagger the exits, and in that way you're going to create a lot of variety in your music. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, you can leave a like, subscribe for more. And I do live streams every Monday if you want to tune in and ask me some questions. I've got that linked in the description as well.